I think we can start. Welcome to everyone to the Cooper Union School of Architecture lecture series. Thank you for being here. It's great to see some familiar and some new, I guess, names. Feel free to, participate more actively if you'd like to turn your video on, especially later during the conversation. I think it would be wonderful to kind of treat this as a seminar session. And I know that Nicolas and Joanna are particularly looking forward to the conversation afterwards. So this is a small series titled Pluriversal, Bewildered, and Otherwise. And it's really kind of opening up the question of the multiple potential practices of architecture that, put into question, scrutinize, and also offer alternative models to a mode of practice that refuses architecture as a kind of service to capitalist and colonial extractions. And I think the conversation today about sacrifice and loss is a particularly exciting one. And I also, it's also in a kind of also a way of putting forward and highlighting the practice of Joanna and Nicolas adjustments agencies, which is one that is, I think, constantly in information, and I think also inspiring. So I'll start just by introducing Nicolas Caroti and Joanna Joseph right after. I thank you both very much for accepting the invitation and being here. Nicolas Caroti is a writer, designer, and researcher from LA and currently based in Milan, which I think is where you are at the moment, right? Yeah. His writing has been featured in many publications, including Kaleidoscope, Harvard Design Magazine, Metropolis, e-flux Architecture, as well as The Uses of Decorating, a collection of essays translated into Spanish and published in Madrid in 2020. His visual work has been exhibited at various international institutions, including the Swiss Institute, the Triennale di Milano, and the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, and others. He holds a Master's of Science in Critical, Conceptual, and Curatorial Practices from Columbia University's GSAP, which is also where we met, and teaches at the Design Academy Eindhoven. He's the managing editor of Capsule and co-founder of Adjustments Agencies, and founder of Interiors Agency, and is a longtime collaborator with Joanna Joseph. Joanna Joseph is an editor, educator, and writer based in Brooklyn. She's an assistant adjunct professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and associate editor at Columbia University's Books on Architecture and the City, and also a contributing editor to the Avery Review. She's a co-founder of Adjustments Agency with Nick Caroti, and her writing appeared in Spike Art Magazine, Harvard Design Magazine, and many other publications as well. I guess, a lot of the exhibitions are also joint. So the Milan Architecture Triennale, the Swiss Institute, and is also a graduate of the CCCP program, the Critical, Curatorial, and Conceptual Practices program at Columbia. I will pass on the screen to Joanna and Nick. I'm very excited to hear about this fascinating project. Thank you.
Thank you, Nura, and thank you for inviting us and for having us. Joanna, do you want to share your screen? Yes. Great. So as Nura said, I'm Nicolas, and I'm sharing with Joanna right now. We're Adjustments Agency. We began working together a few years ago, and we call ourselves kind of we're a research-based practice, but we like to describe as an architecture of architecture studio, meaning we're interested in how the limits of architectural thinking are delineated by various agents of ruling relations alongside other actors. In broad strokes, our early work focused on economies of discursive production, in particular funding mechanisms like corporate sponsorship that support or fail to support academic inquiry and experimental practice in architecture. From there, our work began to look more broadly at the imbrication of the field within the circuitry of contemporary finance capitalism, primarily within a US-American context, beginning around the 1970s and leading up to today. The bulk of this research could be roughly bisected into, on the one hand, the financialization of architecture, or how the profession and discipline have adopted its operating logics, and on the other, the architecture of financialization, or the instrumental role of real estate within contemporary financial markets, and in turn, how the dominance of these markets manifests spatially. These concerns are all interwoven, of course, particularly through attendant processes of subject formation. For instance, high on a heady mix of managerialism and CAD software, architects were, in a sense, primed for co-option as supply chain operators for securities markets. Cost-optimized housing units were churned out to meet the artificial demand created by subprime lending, while designers adopted a pseudoscientific shelf assurance, similar to that advanced by neoliberal economists and policymakers, to legitimate predatory practices. Or, inversely, the homeowner facing exorbitantly adjusted mortgage payments, or better yet, their kid saddled with a lifetime worth of debt by 25, has little choice but to accept the ethical compromises and exploitative conditions that remain endemic to professional practice today. So suffice it to say, this was all pretty dark, and the deeper we delved, the more depressed we got by our research. Following in what could be called a grand neurotic tradition, we tried to elevate our own malaise into something like a diagnostic manual through which we might read the world. This led us to a project about architecture's work culture and its harmful effects on not only architectural workers, but also all the people and things who have to live in the world that they build. This work was primarily informed by literature on the politics of refusal and attempted to consider its viability today. After that, we figured we might try putting theory to practice and took a break for a while. The project we're presenting today is titled On Loss, Sacrificial Rites of Architecture, and it was developed for 2 exhibitions in Milan. The first, titled The State of the Art of Architecture, was held at the Triennale di Milano and curated by Joseph Grima of Space Caviar. The second was a solo exhibition at Super Attico, which is a project space here, curated by the architectural collectives Captcha, Abnormal, and Pale Blue Dot. Finally, aspects of this research were also featured in the 10th issue of Real Review, which is a magazine published in London by Jack Self. Before we get into it, I want to quickly note that this work is likely better framed as fragments and speculations rather than as an exhaustive exploration of the topic. It's a poor archive, and in a bit we'll get into why that is. A poor archive composed of ruins, in a sense. And what we'll be talking about is essentially a series of annotations, which are our own biased reflections.
So both as a Adjustments Agency and in our own independent research practices, a lot of our work begins by approaching objects that are either taken as givens or simply so banal and ubiquitous they escape notice. In fact, we found that often they're designed that way. Bland is a preferred flavor of power. It masks the political as the normal and the status quo as unassailable. For instance, golden visa programs such as EB-5 in the United States have become a primary and insidious mechanism of development funding, massively redistributing both capital and citizenship rights into the hands of a select few. They're sold in brochures that look like this. So boring, it's hard to see, and yet strangely assuring, almost like an infographic. Its claim to legitimacy is automatic, performed visually rather than articulated. Confronting this effective potency requires a sort of willful alienation. By that, I mean one of those fleeting experiences of estrangement from the familiar. Like when you've been writing for too long and can't shake the feeling that the word just doesn't look right. For example, photos like these start to look less like simple and banal PR events and start getting weird. A surreal tableau multiplied endlessly, featuring smiling people wearing business suits and hard hats while using large gold-plated shovels to move scoops of artificial dirt around a wooden box. The groundbreaking, as most of you probably know, is an event held to celebrate the onset of a construction project, formally designating the beginning of a chain of events that will entail the continuous mobilization of materials, labor, and capital for several years, decades, or even centuries. There are thousands of them held around the world every year, but the vast majority of building projects begin unnoticed and unheralded. Typically, groundbreakings adhere to a prescribed script and a set of props. They feature rehearsed speeches and requisite laudations, while the various actors in the development pose for photographs while oversized and gilded prop tools. Somewhere between the grotesque and the infantile, hyperbolic scale is deployed alongside surface sheen in a crude pantomime of labor performed by the thieves of its value. The capitalists are cosplaying as workers. In this gesture, one might even detect a hint of cruelty, condescension, if not outright mockery. And yet that's not quite it. For one, groundbreaking is still too anodyne to merit real indignation, but there's more at play. Why these signifiers of manual labor in the hands of those who do not engage in it? Why plate it in gold? Why cover the ground and ship it in its manufactured facsimile? Like commodity fetishism in reverse, labor is exposed and deployed as spectacle. Meaning is instated and evacuated simultaneously, a mise on a beam of alienated labor and alienated imagery in service of alienable property. Groundbreakings are rituals featuring a shared vocabulary of performative utterances and visual cues. While certainly abstract, the gilded shovels are nonetheless symbols, perhaps meant to represent the union of labor and capital involved in construction. Boring, maybe, but also infused with an optimism that performs consensus and confidence, as if establishing positivity as fact. Groundbreakings are outwardly public-facing, acting like a welcome mat without a door, an invitation that neither grants access to the building nor a share of the profits it will generate.
But positivity is far from fact. Buildings come at a cost. People are displaced, resources are extracted and consumed, capital is diverted, accumulated, and concentrated. Even the word groundbreaking is a misnomer, if not an outright lie. There is no unbroken ground, not now and not ever. Before foundations can be laid, what was there before must be removed. An older building is demolished. An estuary is filled with dirt. Trees are uprooted, ecosystems irreparably altered. People are relocated, dislocated, or exterminated, and with them, the culture and traditions they once maintained. Groundbreakings, in other words, not only fail to acknowledge, but actually deflect awareness away from such loss. And yet, strangely enough, they are the contemporary inheritors of a long history of ceremonial practices that accompanied building and were centered precisely around loss. Obscured by the secular posturing of finance capital and the banality of such corporate aesthetics, the origins of groundbreaking ceremonies lie within European traditions of builders' rites that date back to the pre-modern, pre-Christian era, and which were meant to ensure the stability of a building's foundations. The specifics of these rites varied considerably across geographies, cultures, and time periods, but almost invariably involved some sort of sacrifice. In turn, the object of sacrifice, as well as the specific intention behind the act, differed from site to site, although the general belief was that it would ensure the stability of the structure. The record of these traditions is fragmented. Some can be found on archaeological digs, others in mythologies and folklores. Much of what we've found comes from anthropological texts, particularly from the 19th and early 20th centuries, and are steeped in a normative moralism that presumes an absolute rupture from the past, and in cases where the subject matter is non-Western European, make ready use of Orientalist tropes. A grain of salt is not nearly enough for these texts. In short, there's no cohesive framework or narrative with which to understand these practices, or the strange ways they somehow haunt the present. Rather, if meaning might be discerned in their transmission, it lies in the cacophony of their echoes and the lossy compression of their encoding. Today, if you have any mental association with building rights at all, it's probably to Freemasonry, a fraternal organization, there we go, a fraternal organization or men's club that traces its history back to 14th century stonemason guilds in Europe. Shrouded in secret, their ritualistic practices instrumentalize Masonic tools to convey a moral code derived largely from Judeo-Christian norms and Enlightenment ideals. Like groundbreaking, Masonic rites convert labors and technologies of construction into symbols. However, their rites are not practiced on construction sites for the public eye, but behind the locked doors of lodges for bourgeois male self-edification. A more pertinent historical precedent lies closer to home, at least for those of us from the Anglophone world. The popular children's singing game, London Bridge is Falling Down, deals with repeated attempts to shore up and repair one of the bridges spanning the Thames. The most famous verse of its modern iteration goes, London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady. Typically, as it's sung, two players hold hands and make an arch with their arms, while the others pass through in a single file. The arch is then lowered at the song's end to catch a player. Most likely dating back to the Middle Ages, several theories have been advanced as to the origins of the song, the game, including most notably a lingering cultural memory of a foundation sacrifice in which a child was killed in order to ensure the stability of the structure. While there's no archaeological evidence of a sacrifice in the foundations of the bridge, that doesn't mean it's pure fancy. Human bones have been found, for example, in the foundations of St. Peter's and Paul's Church in Holdsworthy, which was built roughly around the same time as the London Bridge in the 13th century. The complete skeleton of a man was unearthed in the church of Wickenby in Lincolnshire, and two skeletons were discovered in a church at Brownsover. Children's bones specifically were found beneath Bridgegate in Bremen, Germany, which was also built around this time.
Archaeology provides material evidence of human foundation sacrifices, but folklore and oral tradition do more to illuminate them. Perhaps one of the most ubiquitous iterations of foundation sacrifice are the Master Mason legends found in Europe. Taking the form of either ballad or epic poem, the Master Mason legends position the act of building as a sacrilegious and hubristic event, angering and disrespecting a divine power who derails a structure's completion. As such, the Master Mason legends situate the building as a site of transaction, whereby the ritual of human immurement ensures the building's stability. In Romania, a particular legend based on the Curtea de Argus monastery still holds great national significance. The story follows the talented mason Manol, who was commissioned by Prince Radu Negru to build the most beautiful monastery in the country. When Manol and his 9 builders were consistently thwarted by the monastery's crumbling walls, Manol supposedly dreamt, according to the ballad, "A voice from heaven told me clearly that all our works will collapse until we together swear here to seal up in the wall the first woman, wife or sister who appears tomorrow at dawn carrying a living thing for one among you." Manol and his men thus agreed that the first of their wives to visit the site would become subject to this sacrifice, and eventually Manol's own wife, Anna, who was pregnant, first approached the site. Although heartbroken, Manol allegedly had to keep his promise. He and his men tricked Anna, saying they wanted to play a game building walls around her body, which she soon realized was no game at all. The ballad describes in gruesome detail Anna's anguish, the immurment's killing of her unborn child, the breaking of her body, and the draining of her breasts. Despite, or rather because of this tragedy, once Anna was firmly entombed within the monastery walls, the building stood strong. The Master Mason myths found across Europe record variations on this narrative. The Bridget Arta legend in Greece tells of a bird tricking the mason's wife into the construction site, while the legend of the Rozafa castle in Albania, the immured woman's breast is left exposed to feed her newborn child, fulfilling her maternal duties even after death. Their complexity, alongside the regional differences of each of these tales, belies a singular way of reading or codifying them, and the worldview they convey can feel inconceivably foreign to our contemporary perspective. Nevertheless, the Master Mason legends all follow the same general theme. A woman, beloved to one of the builders, must be the object of sacrifice to appease a divine force. These stories present a morality tale of religious deference, later retold in the modern era, often in service of a nationalist agenda, in particular during periods of foreign occupation. The woman, a maternal figure, is seen as central to the stability not only of the building, but to the nation itself, as she represents the future through her reproductive capabilities. The ultimate sacrifice, in other words. Thus, the Master Mason myth encodes specific and complex social hierarchies where women are both essential and yet expendable in service of greater agendas. Particular forms of labor are also unequally codified within the Master Mason legends, where the burden of sacrifice falls upon the laborer and not the patron. In the legend of Manol, this burden is further extended, whereby legend has it the prince trapped Manol and his workers on the roof of the monastery to prevent them from building another beautiful monastery elsewhere, ultimately causing their deaths. Here we find already an abuse of power within the labor relations of the building site, as well as an individualized attachment to building. Thus, architecture becomes a powerful metaphor for shoring up cultural and national identities, as well as a lens with which to perceive both value and disposability within a society.
Another dominant motif in these folklores is deception. While in the Romanian version, the wife is tricked into thinking that her immurement is a game, in one Greek telling, her husband pretends to have dropped his ring. And in another, a bird is asked to stall the mason's wife, but does the opposite, encouraging her to arrive faster. In fact, deception is a recurring theme of foundation sacrifice accounts across Europe. The walls of Copenhagen were said to contain the remains of a little girl who was given sweets and toys as a distraction while builders constructed an arch around her, eventually burying her alive to the sound of drums and trumpets. Similarly, a Thuringian legend describes a small boy sold by his own mother who is placated with cake as he's immured, and who hauntingly cries out, "Mother, I see thee still. Mother, I see thee a little still." And finally, "Mother, now I see thee no more." While in these accounts, it is the sacrificial victim who is deceived. In others, it's the devil. That is, another major genre of foundation sacrifice lore swap abstract supernatural forces with a specific figure of the Judeo-Christian devil. In these, the sacrifice is not in service of placating some supernatural force or atoning for hubris. Instead, the builder typically makes a deal with the devil in order to facilitate construction, to make the structure stronger, to build it faster, or to make it more impressive. In other words, it's less a logic of debt than investment. And like with most investments, the ambition is to reap the highest possible returns with the least loss. A substantial portion of these legends involve bridges, which were typically feats of engineering that seemed impossible at the time, necessitating supernatural assistance. So-called devil's bridges can be found throughout Europe. A paradigmatic account surrounds the Alte Brücke in Frankfurt, which actually might be the next slide, Joe. Yeah, there we go. This is the Alte Brücke in Frankfurt, which has been repeatedly built and destroyed at least 18 times since 1222 for a variety of reasons, from floods to the Nazi Wehrmacht. Until 1914, each iteration of the bridge was marked by circular arches. The brothers Grimm recount the legend in their Deutsche Sagen. A builder had agreed to complete a bridge by a certain date, but as it approached, he saw that it would be impossible to meet the deadline, so with only 2 days remaining, he called upon the devil and asked him for help. The devil appeared to him and offered to complete the bridge during the last night if the builder would deliver to him the first living being that crossed the bridge. The contract was settled, and the devil completed the bridge. At the break of day, the builder came and drove a rooster across the bridge ahead of himself, thus delivering it to the devil. But the devil had expected a human soul, and when he saw that he had been deceived, he angrily grabbed the rooster, ripped it apart, and threw it through the bridge, thus causing its arches. Obviously, the bridge has been rebuilt several times since the days of the Grimms, but the legend not only remained in place, but has also been enshrined in the famous Briekageikel, a gold-plated rooster that is perched in the center of the bridge to this day. It is likely that such folklore did not develop independently from sacrifice legends oriented around appeasement, but rather emerged out of them, a sort of syncretic hybrid of pagan and Christian mythologies. It's possible they also reflect changes in sacrificial traditions, such as the substitution of humans for animals or inanimate effigies. Indeed, the archaeological record evidences far more animal foundation sacrifices than human. In particular, horse skulls and dried cat corpses have been found in walls and beneath thresholds throughout Europe. Of course, that does not necessarily mean these sacrifices were embedded within a similar theological framework as the one illustrated by the Alte Brücke. Horses in particular have long been used as sacrificial offerings around the world in an animist belief that their strength might transfer to the structure. Nevertheless, accounts such as these suggest a markedly different transactionalism in sacrificial rites. In both, sacrifice can be understood as something like a strategy of risk management, in which investments made in the present can prevent future loss. But while the master mason legends presuppose an originary debt involved in architecture and condemn the hubris of assuming loss might be avoided, the Devil's Bridge accounts applaud the ability to minimize that loss. The builder faces no punishment for his deception.
Sometime in the centuries between then and now, sacrifice fell largely out of favor in Europe, although there are reports that suggest it continued in certain communities well into the 19th century, particularly during moments of social upheaval. In a way, sacrifice itself was sacrificed within the self-fashioning of European identity. Sacrifice, of course, is associated with paganism, despite the fact that it was evidently practiced by ostensible Christians, as suggested by the human remains within church buildings, belying an easy narrative of conversion. In Judeo-Christian belief, in fact, the prohibition against human sacrifice is itself a sort of ideological or foundation myth, famously represented by the last-minute intervention of God to stop Abraham from sacrificing his son Isaac, which God had ordered as a test of faith. This falls within an expansive tradition of ideological sacrifices or their prevention. Rome, for example, was founded with the blood of Remus, while the young wizard Merlin was almost sacrificed to stabilize a castle tower, but was spared with the revelation that its instability was caused by dueling dragons, representing the conflict between Saxons and Britons. One might argue that the rise of modern liberalism was secured with the regicide of Louis XVI during the Reign of Terror. Around this time, Europeans began the genocidal conquest of the Americas. As they slaughtered and pillaged indigenous people, the Spanish conquistadors relayed accounts of their barbarism, particularly in the case of the Aztecs and their use of sacrifice, even as sacrifice was still practiced in the so-called Old World. These narratives remain the primary account of indigenous sacrificial practices, and considering their instrumentalization within the project of colonialism cannot be taken as documentary evidence, let alone as a means of understanding indigenous belief systems. Rather, we might glean more from situating them as technologies of self-representation and self-fashioning within the broader project of early European capitalism. At the same time as Europeans deployed sacrifice as a defense for the slaughter of indigenous Americans, they embarked on a massive project of institutionalized femicide. The witch trials, which contemporary feminist historians have convincingly argued was instrumental for the development of modern capitalism, predicated on the physical confinement of women and the expropriation of the value produced by their labor, both reproductive and otherwise. Often, alleged witches were accused of sacrificing children. Likewise, this period was one of the most significant within the long history of Christian persecution against Jews, famously rationalized with the anti-Semitic canard of blood libel, or the accusation that Jews were kidnapping and murdering Christian children to use their blood in rituals. On an economic level, this provided another influx of expropriated wealth that preceded and enabled accumulation through production, since Jews in this period were not subject to restrictions on usury and therefore free to lend money at interest. It also served a social function, with women and non-Christians serving as the scapegoats for events such as the Black Death. Thus, sacrifice might be situated alongside colonialist genocide and capital punishment within a broader continuum of European technologies of disciplinary power and domination, both in its deployment and its refusal. In fact, specific sacrificial tactics were often simply refashioned into modes of punishment. Immurement, in particular, was often reserved for women, specifically nuns, who were accused of violating their oaths and engaging in sexual behavior. The Alte Brücke in Frankfurt was also a famous site for executions, primarily for women accused of infanticide, incest, or abortion.
Sensationalized accounts of the sacrificial practices of the barbaric or savage other remain a major motif within the literature that accompanied projects of European colonialism and imperialism well into the contemporary era. One late 19th century anthropological text, for example, alleges foundation sacrifice among the Maori, described as, quote, a barbarous custom as old as the days of human superstition and human folly. Concurrently, European settlers in New Zealand confiscated Maori land en masse, forcing them into a position of economic precarity and dependence that persists by and large to today, wherein disproportionate numbers of Maori face significant economic and social obstacles and generally have lower life expectancies and incomes compared with other New Zealand ethnic groups. While less direct, we might discern a thread between European narratives surrounding the foundation sacrifice practiced in medieval Japan, called Hido Bashira, and accusations of exceptional cruelty and barbarism, another quote, levied against the Japanese by Americans during the Second World War. In short, the sacrifice of sacrifice by Europeans, their capacity to first cheat the devil and later do away with him altogether, can be understood as a component within the self-fashioning of cultural superiority integral to the project of colonial capitalism. After all, if you can reap returns without expenditure or loss, isn't that a sign of power? Rather than a historical rupture in which sacrifice is done away with altogether, we might glean more from imagining a continuum of practices and beliefs intended to deal with and mitigate the loss that accompanies a building project, which is predominantly structured through a logic of abstraction and substitution. The life of the woman is exchanged for the integrity of the structure, the human for the chicken, sacrifice itself for new mechanisms of risk mitigation. Through these creative substitutions, the loss almost appears to vanish altogether. But in reality, it is simply the theology of the sacrifice that changes. One might venture that this logic of substitution and abstraction is co-constituted with that of capitalism generally, whose ideology of growth demands a constant stream of new sacrificial victims, new territories for expansion and sources of cheap and precarious labor. Rather than to appease a supernatural river spirit, blood is spilled in the name of civilizational progress or urban renewal or maintaining growth rates. Rather than the devil who is tricked, it's the working classes who are denied social services through the invention of a host of technologies, from EB-5 visas to tax write-offs, that enable capital accumulation and hoarding. But every act of building demands collateral. Individual humans. Today, we can calculate down to the last penny the expenses of construction. We can run BIM software and anticipate things that might go wrong, and then take all sorts of measures to prevent it. We even diligently note the consequences of these endeavors on our environment, however narrow or wide a meaning that may have. But we seem to have forgotten that every building entails a fundamental and irreparable loss, which can never be mathematically calculated or strategically mitigated. To make, quite fundamentally, is to lose. Sometimes it's worth it, sometimes it's necessary. But that expenditure is still real, and it is, like all loss, a certain tragedy. Architecture demands sacrifice. That's what the groundbreaking ceremony is about, the solemn responsibility assumed in deciding if that loss is worth it. It's understanding, accepting, and ritualizing that we will never make whole again the ground that we broke. Forgetting that, or thinking we can overcome it, has brought us here to 420.63 parts per million of atmospheric carbon growing by the minute. The collecting agency is knocking on the door, and one way or another, they will take what is owed them. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. It's totally fascinating. I want to invite everyone who's here, if you would like to, again, kind of turn your video on, join the conversation. This will be fluid and informal. It would be great to see you and have your participation here with us. Thank you both so much for this. I guess I have so much that I'd love to bring back to the table, and I mean, I think that okay, let's start with something that that has been on my mind since you started presenting, and it's kind of it's a half joke, but Twin Peaks, Dr. Amps talking about shoveling ourselves out of the shit. with a gold-plated shovel. And I don't know who here is a Twin Peaks fan, or who might help kind of read that in this lens. I do think that there may be something that that we could bring in from that kind of from David Lynch's Dr. Amp into this conversation. And I don't know if I have an answer to how we would do that. But I guess, you know, the hypocrisy of the ritual itself, and I guess, you know, all the way to Albright's remarks on the death of Iraqi kids being worth it, you know, whether in the context of the act of building itself, or of expansion on a larger scale. And this, I guess, the notion of shoveling something out of the shit while kind of producing the same thing while doing the shoveling, I think is the kind of, I guess, how
Lunchtime.
Someone here. So there are some, there's a question actually by CCK Lancaster. Another understanding of the word sacrifice is to give willingly of yourself or service rather than giving an unwilling other. Do you see the discipline giving itself willingly or sacrificed by others? I guess is one question. And another would be sacrificing privilege, sacrificing profit. I mean, where do we see that kind of conversation going? Like, what other forms of ritual around sacrifice can we imagine?
Joanna, do you have any thoughts? I think I can. I mean, I think there's something to be said about like this notion of the discipline. I think that a lot gets kind of done. I mean, gets done in the name of there being a discipline. The kind of like, right, like you see this, I think, as particularly now, and in some of the structures that some of these firms are adopting, particularly in New York, right, where you have like we're willing to like lose a little bit of our fee so that we can have equity in the building. And that's done in the name of, let's say, the firm, but does it actually work, like trickle down to the workers? And of course, also the sense of like, who is the architectural worker, I think becomes part of this question. There's the kind of employees of a firm, there's its interns and like unpaid labor force. And then of course, there's the construction workers. And I think that like, to understand like what the discipline is and how it could possibly give itself willingly, or like, there's a lot of sense, I think, of noblesse oblige and how architecture self-fashions that I think is extends out of, let's say, this, well, on the one hand, like the kind of history of the profession emerging out of like a gentleman's profession, right? A kind of like a bourgeois hobby. But then more broadly, this I think a lot happens, or it gets, let's say, kind of obscured within the kind of self-fashioning of architecture as a public service. That therefore kind of ushers in exploitative practices, both within a firm, but also allows for things like kind of like devastatingly violent and exploitative work conditions on a site, because architecture sees itself only as the people who make the plans, right, or direct them and then sign them off. So I don't know if that answers the question, but do I see the discipline as giving itself willingly or sacrificed by others? I think a lot of people get sacrificed by architecture, I guess would be my answer. I don't know. What about you, Joe?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really, really interesting question. I mean, I think that there is, as Nick was saying, like a very strong like notion and sort of like faith in sacrifice, and like a story that is kind of told throughout the institution, throughout the firm, that like it's a self like reproducing sacrifice, or a culture of sacrifice that pervades the workplace, as a way of committing oneself to the long hours, the grueling work of architecture. And I think that obviously is like kind of a long-standing discussion, but one that I think is still sort of pertinent and urgent to say, and to kind of talk about. But yeah, I think that's a really, really fine line between sort of like, where does the agency kind of exist within that, who is sacrificed and who is self-willing. I think, I don't know, it's super complex and sort of how architectural workers kind of see themselves and their kind of rights across both the office and the building site, as Nick was saying. And I think that maybe more movement or more conversations would be happening if like conversations across or like outside of the office or across the building site, across the industry were happening to kind of understand that chain of sacrifice in a way.
Yeah, I think also to add one more thing to that is the kind of question of like this like autotelic logic of architecture, which is I think similar to the autotelic or like ends in itself logic of capitalism more generally, which is production for the sake of production. So a lot gets like a lot is architects or people who have some investment in, let's say, cultural production more broadly even are willing to sacrifice a lot for the sake of what they think is the advancement of culture or the like the need for the construction of new form, depending on like where you sit in the field. If you're a formalist, for the like, okay, it's worth taking all of this embodied carbon and emitting it back into the atmosphere for the sake of a new experiment in formalism. Or if you're, you know, I think even within, let's say, the ecologically minded or at least ecologically framed sides of architecture, once again, that like, you know, you can put together these like kind of manifestos for why a project should be built, but like very rarely does it kind of include the cost of demolition within it. And so I think that like part of this is that something that's a labor of love on the one hand, right, within the workforce, but then also something that like is seen as part of let's say our common I don't know what the word would be, like our common heritage, like the like, you know, the act of building is in itself a good thing, or that like architecture is in itself a good thing, carries on this legacy of sacrifice in a kind of abstracted or mutated form.
I wonder if in your research you've come across moments where, and how this would kind of fit into this project, moments of disruption of these rituals, of I don't know, sabotage, making them, you know, producing, let's say, another mediated and also kind of visible protest or refusal of this very ritual on the ground. I wonder how that would fit into this story.
Yeah, there are some in the Master Mason legends, the ones we sort of cited as coming from like the Balkans and also in Greece, whereby there's a couple different versions, but in the one I told about Minol in the Romania example with the cathedral, whose the master builder's wife was sacrificed. He is sort of like aware, you know, of this sacrifice and sees his wife coming along the path and sort of like tries to summon divine powers to intervene and send all of these weather events to kind of like stall her or deter her from coming. And so, but that it doesn't stop her. Like the theme is sort of that her love for him is so strong that she's willing to kind of like push through all of these disastrous weather events to reach him. And that sort of theme of like romantic love and familial duty as like ultimately trumping any form of sabotage is reproduced across these myths. So it's a similar one in the Brigid Arta in Greece. The woman who is actually sacrificed in the foundations in that legend is again calling upon divine powers to kind of ask for the building to fall and also for anyone who walks across it. But then she sort of realizes that, you know, her own family members might walk across the bridge, which would send them to their death. So she sort of changes this kind of curse at the or prayer at the last moment. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to sort of see them kind of surface always along the lines, or at least the ones that I've seen, Nick, I don't know if other accounts, but like along the lines of like familial love and sort of like reproducing and maintaining the bonds of the family structure.
Yeah, there's certainly a sense, I think, within these Balkan folklores of like a fatedness that like you can't, no matter what you do, it's kind of very like similar to like an Oedipal kind of structure where like no matter what you do, it's going to happen. With the kind of what we kind of, we kind of split these different traditions, which is maybe more or less historically accurate. The ones like with the devil's bridges, like the one in the Alta, I think one could argue that like the substitution of the human life for the chicken is a kind of sabotage or cheating, but it ultimately like there's still this kind of I guess what you see is like in the various like folkloric traditions is like different kind of effective structures for how human resistance is dealt with. So in the like in the ones in the Balkans, there's really like they try and resist and it fails. In the ones that come out of Western Europe roughly concurrently, they do sabotage it, but it's still kind of, there's still this violence that's going on. I think also, I mean, maybe to that question, there's also something that we've really struck upon, or that really struck us was the refusal of sacrifice that happens within European culture, having like the simultaneity of like these transmissions of sacrifice texts across the Atlantic, the use of human sacrifice as a reason to defend like the mass slaughter of indigenous people in Americas was concurrent with, on the one hand, like just like literally human sacrifices happening in Europe. These sacrifices went up until the 19th century or even 20th century, but also with things like the witch trials. And so you have this like kind of sense of like, like I think Nuri, maybe you were hoping for like a kind of a more like a line of flight out of this, but I think that what we noticed with like the resistance to sacrifice became in fact a kind of mechanism for like let's say modernity and its brutality, rather than like a different thing.
There's a question that just came up by Catherine Lewis. This brings to mind, well, she said, thank you for the presentation, fascinating. This brings to mind how the destruction of architecture landmarks has been used as a type of sacrificial altar. I'm not sure if you wanted to, Catherine, if you wanted to jump in or if you wanted to respond to that. And also I was thinking maybe you could share that video. I mean, seeing the lengths, what's the length? I don't know if the lengths is the word, like seeing where these rituals what they have reached in terms of performance, production.
Sure, I can.
What that conversation might lead to in terms of also how we might continue the conversation after seeing that.
Sure, yeah, happy to. I can share that really quickly. Let's see. Wait, how do I do this? I really should know how to do this already. Here. Can you see it?
Yeah, if you could pause for a second before, because I think that there's a question about, like we can keep it on the screen and I'll ask this question first. I'm curious about the role of the argument or the observation that architecture always demands sacrifice. This is by Dikle Taskin. The observation that architecture always demands sacrifice in a context where the construction industry increasingly depend on the precarity of its workforce. Migrant construction workers whose deaths are not accounted for or trivialized, for example. Do you think this argument might run the risk of naturalizing, legitimizing these deaths, or can it be an instrument to encourage accountability within the field and practice?
I think that's a great question. Right. I mean, I think that like luckily not many developers are reading or are aware of what we do, but I think that is a good question. Like what happens if like in some ways I think that kind of that line comes from us in almost kind of like a kind of law of thermodynamics sense where like architecture literally requires like to be like right now at least, but I'm also not so much of a kind of techno optimist that like I can imagine a type of building that doesn't come with some form of extraction, some kind of like even just like the like the kind of the wear and tear of bodies, as kind of like Mark says, that happens with any kind of production in general, even when using machine, that like there's this relationship that like there's some loss, and it's about like how much loss is okay, I think is a question that we're hoping to bring up. Not like, I mean, I think there is an interesting idea of like a moratorium on construction, which some people are advancing, I think in like Switzerland, But I think Charlotte Martel Bart. But I think that that's an interesting question. Like if you kind of naturalize the idea that like there's always going to be loss, and okay, it doesn't matter how little we pay our construction workers or how many people die on our site. I think one of the questions that we're trying to bring up, rather than like the loss is endemic and therefore acceptable, or on the other hand, that like therefore architecture has to just go away, is more about like to kind of take ownership of that, the evaluative rubrics that we use to gauge and like to judge whether or not that loss is acceptable, because that's always going on already. It's just a question of like how it's done and who has access, who's in the room to allow for that evaluation, right? Like who's accepted into the room of evaluation.
Thank you. Mauricio, I think this was your question that I don't know if you want to read it yourself or if I should.
I can read it. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really clarifying, and I think symbols are really powerful. And just learning the narratives or recognizing the narratives that are baked into things. So yeah, your critique of groundbreaking as a symbolic performance and a lens through which to recognize the sacrifices that are built into architecture clarifies its public-facing working ethos. In shaking the formal surface, your presentation unravels. Have you arrived at other forms, rituals, recognitions, and or symbols that might mark resistance and or practices that maintain ground without sacrificing our future, our work, our bodies, our relations to the land?
Joanna, maybe do you have any?
I'm chewing on that.
It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a really good question.
I kind of like wish I could say yes. I wish I had like a ready answer. I mean, it's kind of a tricky question because of course there are these very visible forms of activism against, like, let's say development, like corporate development, but I mean, it's an interesting field, right? So there's like NIMBYism, YIMBYism. I'm not so like, I can't really speak very intelligently about these different, let's say discourses, I guess. But I do think that the question then that if they become ritualistic is interesting, and one that I'd like to explore. And like, maybe does it become pejorative if you say people blocking an active construction is ritualistic? So I guess because these are so outward facing, so ritualistic, so almost like a kind of pantomime, that they kind of like, that's why they stood out to us. But about then, I don't know. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. Where would this like operate within the logic of ritual? Would resistance to kind of development operate with? I'm not sure. Joanna, maybe you have thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that question of ritual is super interesting, and I think obviously we can again, think about forms of activism against development or infrastructure, and in the way that I think land protectors are protecting a ritualized way of life and maintaining relationships with the ground. So I think like those would be examples to look at where I think ritual takes on a completely different form or sort of worldview from the kind of pantomime or hyper performative gestures here that sort of like this here is for legitimizing a certain action that is like always kind of determined by violence and extraction and loss. So I think that they would be like categorized differently. I mean, I think to the extent that our work has maybe started to engage those contemporary practices, like I think we've been really steeped in this history, but I think it's a really, really amazing question that we should hold in conversation and tension with the work.
Yeah, it's a great point, because also like I think that one of the things that like, and that we don't really like properly make note of in this research so far, but like I think that we probably should if we continue with it, is like how much like these rituals, the groundbreaking ceremonies, which we're claiming as rituals, are disconnected from any kind of like cosmology or like meaning system.
Yeah.
To the point where they're very just kind of like, I mean, they're like they take on almost a hue of absurdism. whereas, let's say, if there is aspects of ritual invested in forms of resistance, it would be within a kind of like a different, let's say, level of relationship with the systems of meaning that produce it. And like, but like the rituals, the sacrificial rituals, the sacrificial rites that we talk about historically, like the kind of pre and early modern ones, obviously were invested in a cosmology. And so where that rupture takes place, where it becomes kind of like this empty gestures, I don't know, is something that it'd be kind of fantastic to try and find out. Yeah.
Shall we play this for a minute?
Yeah, maybe that's a good actual, because this is really just like the kind of most absurd thing. Okay. So just to kind of explain that, that was a trailer version, let's say, of how do I close this? Sorry, for this show we did in Milan recently, but the original video, which I found on YouTube, is to the same song, and it's like an hour long. It shows the entire performance, and it was a groundbreaking to accompany, I believe, a Citibank stadium in San Francisco. And yeah, this is a giant kind of spectacle.
I wonder if you can share with us like how you were reading the different elements of this in relation to your research of where the origins of this ritual are and come from. Like how were you reading the let's say the you know, the presence of the different elements, you know, between from the bulldozer to the kind of the acrobat and the uniforms, and how does this all play into the research? Or does it at all? Or is it, you know, I don't know. How are you thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like one of the levels is like, is what we kind of talk about at the beginning, right? Which is like this pantomime of labor. And here, I mean, it's almost like a kind of, you know, it's like that song YMCA, right? It's you know, like you have like, these are professional dancers wearing construction outfits. And so it does feel, yeah, like a kind of charade of when we were originally starting the research, which really just started with us talking about like, where does this stuff come from? Like, why are they doing this? Why do you have CEOs with gold-plated shovels? And it felt like to us a kind of mockery. And then we kind of shifted our reading into what we came with later. But to the specifics of that video, I don't have so many interpretations. I don't know about you, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, it was like an utterly absurd kind of example that we found. I mean, I think that it's almost like less interest. I mean, it's like wild, but it's like almost less interesting to me than maybe some of the more like ubiquitous, like rehearsed gestures that we were kind of showing in that like slideshow. And I think our work is maybe more interested in kind of like, yeah, challenging or like unearthing a tacit sort of acceptance of these sort of banal rituals that obviously like represent and encode a whole sort of set of systems that like we think need to be or like should be interrogated or drawn attention to. I mean, like even just the fact that I think the most striking thing for me was that these groundbreakings often like literally bring in like a raised platform of like symbolic dirt to like fake shovel out onto the site. And it's sort of like there's something about that gesture that like almost shows the fiction of this idea of groundbreaking, right? That like it's literally impossible to stick a shovel into the dirt. So we have to kind of like manufacture that process somehow. So I think that like was super fascinating for us for the research. And also yeah, I think even this, like you see that in the video as well, but this like harmonizing between you know, like political, you know, officials, developers, laborers, like the need also for manufacturing that kind of harmony also, again, sort of like reveals another fiction about sort of real estate and kind of who it serves, which I think are questions that we were always interested in. So I guess that's, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I think we started reading them.
Like, I think we were just kind of also shocked, like these are some of the objects we made for the original installation. And like, you know, we just got these there's like several competitive companies that just simply make gold-plated ceremonial groundbreaking ceremony objects. And also, as Joanna was saying, yeah, like colored sand, which they import. I mean, probably extracted through some violent process and then shipped somewhere around the world to be put into like a box so that like for 10 minutes a CEO can pretend to be digging. And so like one of the, I think that for us, one of the things is like when we're reading these images, and perhaps it's not a deep enough reading, but when we're reading this kind of culture of groundbreaking ceremonies, is like it felt like the signifiers were so disconnected from their reference that like it was just kind of like happening on its own. But like that, it was kind of a necessity of a building site. And again, you have this sense of like a kind of welcome mat, but without the door. Like these are public facing events. You see that like in Hudson Yards, that, you know, is a really big spectacle when they first did the groundbreaking there. Yeah. And then for a space that, of course, nobody, like, you know, for buildings that no one will ever be able to enter in their entire lives. And so they're posting the videos of these ceremonies on YouTube. This kind of strange, I guess for us, it feels very like a broken semantic system, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think another thing I would say related to that, like at least like I did a lot of work on Hudson Yards and like thinking about, or like just being so steeped into the renderings of that project and like how sort of future realized architecture projects are through their renderings, then to have this kind of like this ritual that's still somehow like presents or takes a moment to like pause on the process, like was a kind of like rupture that I felt like I hadn't encountered so much, or I had maybe taken for granted. And so again, I'm not sure that I really have like a form sort of answer on that, but that kind of disconnect from the ways in which I think we're so like subsumed by images, real or other or imagined, of finished projects. The sort of significance of the groundbreaking, its persistence, is really fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And seems almost to mirror the sense in which like there's a disconnect between architecture as practice and like, let's say the kind of the assumed reason why we do it, which is shelter, to the point where like architecture is probably more a force for the like, you know, for the production of homelessness, or like the loss of territory. I mean, if you think about it in terms of kind of global climate change, it's, you know, quite literally rendering the entire world uninhabitable at a certain point. If architecture and development are responsible for like this lion's share of carbon emissions, then there's no longer kind of, you know, a real clear tie between this like mandate of shelter, the production of shelter that architecture, let's say, originates in, and the actual act of it.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think especially when it's brought to this level of absurdity, it just kind of offers itself as such a productive site for intervention you know, and I think that the way that you've been addressing it, I think makes us all really want to think about how it can be sabotaged, how it can be then, you know, projected differently, projected to reveal really precisely what it tries to evade. And yeah, that's, I think it brings a lot of power. And I think through the kind of lineage that you've laid out, there's a question about, I mean, I think you addressed it a little bit, but I don't know if you wanted to add a little bit more about how this transmutes into university and schools of architecture. You started a little bit on your kind of, you know, your work on labor and work ethics, and I don't know if you wanted to add anything else, especially given, you know, the conversation that's being had right in this moment, not just about SciArc, but, you know, everywhere. And I think it would be really interesting to kind of maybe, I don't know, speak a little bit more clearly about those relationships.
Right. Yeah. Joanna, do you want to go first? Or
If you have something, go ahead.
I mean, I was just having a conversation with my students like yesterday about this. And I think that on the one hand, like we were talking specifically about kind of the performance of excitement, of happiness, of love and desire for design. I am teaching in a design school, not architecture specific, but I think a similar thing it translates. And I think that the question of like, I mean, in schools, I mean, I think in architecture school, you really see the sense where it's like, there's quite literally, I've heard people say, I've heard professors say, like, we did it before, you have to sacrifice quite literally your body and your time, your health, in order for like the sake of the education. And really, one could say that's just a priming for the exploitation endemic to professional practice. I think it is, you know, essentially job training in that sense. I mean, it's supposed to be job training, but what is the real thing that's training you to do is to kind of be willing to sacrifice your own health, but also to make certain calculative logics that like, okay, it's worth doing a construction project, no matter what, because that way my firm will have a name, it will have like a you know, rationale for being, even if, you know, to come into being that, let's say, folly or like installation. I mean, rarely we're even talking about full-scale buildings, requires the exploitation of my students, requires the exploitation of workers, requires, you know, a significant ecological impact, or even a relatively insignificant, but still it's a folly. So like, why? I think that, yeah, I would say that like sacrifice is kind of integral to the architectural education. I mean, maybe a caveat is that neither Joanna and I studied architecture, but we did spend some time at Columbia, and we certainly, you know, sacrificed a little bit of sleep on just studying the theory of it. But I would say that, I mean, that would be kind of, I guess, my kind of take on it.
Yeah, and like, I guess maybe to sort of resurface something that I said earlier, and like, obviously, yeah, there's been like incredible efforts across universities and student workers to organize and unionize and to come together to demand better pay, better condition, better representation in the university. And I think that you also see that happening in some of the movements in architecture firms happening in New York, with obviously Shop had like a failed union drive. But yeah, I think like to be able to find like solidarity and commonality, not just in like your own profession or your own discipline, but somehow across and outside of that, as a way of making demands not for your own conditions, but also for others. And like, I don't know, I think that sort of circles back to that question about like, if architecture demands sacrifice because it's considered a sort of service or a public good, then I think maybe like if there are opportunities to step back and think about how that's actually fostered, and that actually engages the way that people work on design and see themselves in the field. So yeah, hopefully I don't know. That's, I guess,
To kind of
about it.
to bridge off what Joanna's saying is that I also think that like when we were looking at these folklores and these accounts of sacrifice, these historical ones, one of the things that we were kind of struck by was that this kind of constant sense of sacrifice as also being a mechanism for the construction of hierarchy, whether it's in terms of like who the sacrificial victim is, or like, you know, you see, as we kind of mentioned in the in these Baltic folklores that that you already saw this exploitative kind of, or like let's say unequal power relations on the job site very early on, right? So you have the prince who's trapping the construction workers on top of the buildings so they can't build another rival building. And then again, in our kind of reading of it, where sacrifice becomes a mechanism of asserting, let's say, a kind of superiority within the project of European settler colonialism, that perhaps another kind of like, let's say, area to kind of to target within the academy would be how architecture school, what aspects of architecture school are used to train young architects to think that they're better than like a construction worker. Like how architecture is still a kind of self fashioning of superiority over other forms of labor, which seems important for any kind of political resistance to, let's say, as Joanna was just saying, to like what it means to work in the field. I think through building solidarity across the different component labors.
Yeah, and one other thing I would say in terms of thinking about this idea of loss, and we sort of talk about like architecture and maybe even just the development industry, and we could sort of talk about those differences too, but that there is a way of sort of cheating loss, or a way of like somehow always coming up with a solution to sort of like mitigating loss, and any kind of complaint that could be lodged against architecture, like it maybe can come up with a solution for mitigating that. And like the most example like readily available to me is like LEED certifications, right? Like this idea that we sort of come up with this quota that a building hits in terms of its emissions, that like it's good, it's okay, like we can all move on, and even though buildings are still like huge emitters of carbon, like there's a way in which like the industry creates these quotas to preserve its functioning. And so I guess that to me sort of translates into like particular like status quos of the field that I think also trickled down into the discipline, that like hopefully I think like in the academy you could start identifying and also challenging and resisting somehow. And I think like, yeah, there are so many kind of givens in architecture that could be shifted.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know if, you know, the sacrifice economy or sacrifice capitalism, I mean, you could definitely be thinking about and going back to statements of, you know, like the ones of, you know, things being worth it, you know, in the words of Albright, being worth it for the kind of larger, noble, civilizational project of colonial expansion, right? I think it would be really, really amazing to see how you continue developing this work, and how I would personally be really thrilled to see this continue and to stay in touch. I don't know if there are any other questions from people in the room.
Well, you kind of beat me to it by saying worth it. Like, but I was kind of gonna ask a follow-up question of, you have your own practice, which you've identified as not being architecture, and that practice requires sacrifice, which you've identified you needed a break at some point and you took your break. So now you're back to sacrificing. And so in your practice, what is worth that sacrifice? What is worth building today for you?
Good question.
Such a good question. yeah, I think it's like always evolving. Like I think our practice has really, as we said sort of earlier at the presentation, like been interested in the like lineage of refusal and the refusal of work, and like have sort of wanted to kind of like identify the ways in which architecture might participate or sort of revive or revitalize those discussions, and often maybe at the like expense of our own energy. And I think like we've had to take moments to step back and think about like I don't know, making that personal, or like living that somehow, or yeah, like identifying in our practice, like what's worth it, what's not. Are we also practicing the things that we're sort of working out through the research? And I don't know, I don't know what to say about like what feels worth it. I think that if anything, what has really defined like the joy of my experience of this collaboration is like is that like working with Nicolas, and the ways in which we share and push our ideas. It's like incredibly gratifying, and if somehow that can like also sort of sharing it and being energized by folks like you all who participate or engage with our work is incredibly gratifying. Yeah, I don't know, I don't have a rubric for it. I think just like finding ways of always coming back to what's behind what we're putting out, like the joy in that process somehow. I don't know, strange rambly answer.
Yeah, to kind of echo Joanna, I mean, I think that one of the things that we didn't mention, I mean, we're kind of like, let's say, focusing on architecture in the kind of normative sense of how it's framed, but not how we, let's say, practice or the world we inhabit, which is, I mean, like, let's be honest, a gift economy, a giant gift economy. And that is like so much, like, I mean, so like, I guess hovering over this, our research into this is like the work of like philosophers like Georges Bataille, and it's kind of like anthropologists on who studied sacrifice in the early 20th century. And yeah, so I think for Joanna and I, we decided early on that we weren't going to make adjustments agency. We weren't going to do what was necessary, if it would even be possible, to try and make our practice profitable. So we sacrificed profit, let's say, or like the possibility of it ever happening, accepted the kind of loss that comes with gift economies, you know, like joining our friends' reviews or doing that kind of stuff that comes with, let's say, this kind of expanded field aspect of architectural or design practice. Well, I think that like what was clear for us early on was that what we wouldn't want to sacrifice was our friendship. And so it's always been very much like, we just won't take a thing if one of us is busy, because obviously we have to work other jobs. And so we sacrifice, let's say, money and time, and we sacrifice sometimes opportunities for the sake of preserving our friendship. And so I think that is kind of, yeah. So like we love this project. We were just talking earlier today about like how we really want to expand it, but it comes only like when we can, right? Because we also like, we don't want to also sacrifice our weekends. So it's more like what we won't sacrifice, which is our weekends or our friendship. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, like that, I think that's a beautiful way of like sharing your work through, you're really wanting to share a relation, and you want to kind of keep that above, you know, I don't know, just the nihilism that all these practices and building and blah, 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 it's all just burying us in concrete. And to come down to like what you shared together, it's really beautiful for you to, I don't know, include us in that somehow through your project. So thanks.
Thanks for indulging us, our friendship.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And also, I mean, I want to point out to and this might happen kind of later on, no, but making the connection with some of the conversations that we've had early on in the series, and particularly maybe the first this semester on unworlding with Jack Halberstam, and on refusal to build and what that means. And I think how much of a creative process of invention that requires also on behalf, and particularly in the context of a school of architecture, where, like you said, there's a love and desire and for students to be thinking about how to make differently. And so I think that, these become kind of at the heart of the tension, also knowing that there is a necessity for going out and paying back loans and participating in the things that might be against some of these principles and aspirations, but because we wouldn't sacrifice well-being, no? So, I mean, I think that there's, we would love to continue this conversation. And I hope some of the students who are here will somehow also continue to think with us and with you. And I don't know, we'll find ways to continue to and stay in touch. And yeah, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your visit.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you
It's
so
been
much.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nora and Mauricio, thank you for setting this up and having us.
And thanks to everyone who was here and your questions. And see you very soon.
Cool.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.